Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. When Mark moved to next door, I didn't think much of it. He was polite, quiet, and always offered a smile when our paths crossed. My husband was often away for work, leaving me to manage the house on long, empty evenings. Mark started out as just a neighbor of friendly face who offered to help with groceries or carry heavy boxes. One evening, after a long week, he stopped me in the driveway and asked if I'd like to join him for dinner. "Nothing fancy, just pasta and a bottle of wine," he said with an easy grin. I hesitated, reminding myself that I was married, but the thought of sitting alone with leftovers felt heavier than it should have. I told myself it was harmless. Just dinner. His apartment smelled of garlic and basil. Candles flickered softly on the table, and music played in the background. It wasn't romantic in the obvious sense, but there was something intimate about it, something I hadn't felt in years. We laughed over stories, shared pieces of ourselves that usually stayed tucked away, and with each glass of wine, the walls between us thinned out at one point. I caught myself watching the way his eyes lingered on mine just a little too long, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. When my hand brushed against his as we reached for the same bottle, it sent a jolt through me, something I hadn't felt since the early days of my marriage. I kept telling myself it was nothing. That I would go home soon, but time slipped away. Dinner stretched into hours, and the conversation grew deeper, more personal. We talked about loneliness, about longing, about the parts of ourselves we didn't show the world. By the time I stood to leave, the air between us was different, charged. He walked me to the door, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The silence was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. His hand brushed mine again, and this time neither of us pulled away. I left that night without crossing the line, but as I lay awake in bed, replaying the evening in my head, I knew the line had already blurred. Dinner with a neighbor had awakened. Something I thought I had buried long ago. The next time he asked me over, I didn't hesitate. The second dinner was different from the first. I didn't even bother telling myself it was harmless. I knew what I was walking into, yet the pull was stronger than the voice in my head whispering warnings. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in months, one my husband never seemed to notice. And when Mark opened the door, the way his eyes lingered on me told me I wasn't invisible anymore. This time, we didn't talk about small things like work or errands. The conversation picked up where we had left off, about dreams unfulfilled and the ache of loneliness. He told me about a love that never lasted, about the nights he came home to silence. I told him about the nights I fell asleep with my back turned to a man who was supposed to be my partner. There was no judgment between us, only recognition. We ate slowly, each bite only a pause in the flow of words. The wine didn't taste as sweet as the first night, but it wasn't the wine I was craving. When the music softened and the candles melted lower, the silence between us grew heavier, almost unbearable. He reached across the table and took my hand, not by accident this time, but deliberately. His thumb traced slow circles against my skin, and I didn't pull away. I knew I should leave before it went further, but when he rose to clear the plates and brushed past me, his shoulder grazing mine, I stayed seated, unable to move. I was caught in something I didn't fully understand, but I didn't want to escape it either. When he finally sat beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, I turned toward him instead of away. The first time our lips touched, it was almost tentative, like question neither of us knew how to answer. But the second kiss, deeper and longer, erased the hesitation. My heart raced, my breath quickened, and every part of me felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. I should have stopped it, but instead, I leaned into him, chasing the very thing I had been missing. When I finally left his apartment that night, the air was cool and the stars seemed sharper than usual. My hands trembled as I unlocked my own front door, and the house was as dark and silent as always. My husband was away again, but even if he had been there, I wasn't sure it would have mattered. Something inside me had shifted. Mark and I didn't need excuses anymore. The rhythm of our lives began to intertwine quietly, secretly. A shared glance over the fence when we were both outside, texts that were disguised as neighborly but carried weight only we understood. Nights where I found myself at his door under the pretense of borrowing something. Each moment was a choice, and each choice pulled me deeper into a world where guilt and desire lived side by side. And yet, I couldn't deny how alive it made me feel. Every time I laughed with him, every time his eyes lingered on mine like I was someone worth seeing, I realized just how much of myself I had lost. He gave me back pieces I thought were gone forever. Even if they came at the cost of secrets I wasn't ready to face. I knew it couldn't last. Secrets like ours never do. But when I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling in my silent house, all I could think about was the next dinner, the next stolen moment, the next time I would forget, the lines I once swore I'd never cross. Secret became a second life, and like all double lives, it demanded balance I wasn't sure I could manage. My husband came home one weekend earlier than expected, and for the first time in months, I found myself studying him. The way he moved through the kitchen, the way he barely glanced at me while talking about his meetings, it was all so familiar, but now it felt hollow. When he kissed me goodnight, a peck on the cheek that carried no warmth, I thought of Mark's touch, the way his hands lingered as though letting go was the hardest part. I told myself to stop, that I had everything to lose, but then I'd hear the faint knock on my back door when my husband worked late, or see Mark waiting by the fence with a look that made my heart race, and every ounce of resolve would crumble. One night, while my husband was away on yet another trip, Mark invited me over again. The dinner was simpler this time, leftovers and takeout containers, but neither of us cared about the food. We sat on the floor with a bottle of wine between us, laughing so hard that my sides ached. At one point, he reached out, brushing hair from my face, and the laughter melted into silence. That silence became a kiss, and the kiss became something that felt impossible to walk away from. Afterward, I lay in his arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. But with belonging came guilt, sharp and relentless. The next morning, when I walked back into my own kitchen, I froze at the sight of a vase of flowers on the counter with a note from my husband. Thought of you. It should have made me feel cherished, but instead it twisted my stomach. Days passed, and I started noticing subtle changes. My husband looked at me longer than usual, his eyes scanning my face as though searching for something. He asked questions he hadn't asked in years. How was your day? What did you do? Who did you see? They seemed innocent, but they landed with weight I couldn't ignore. I became more careful with Mark. Shorter visits, quieter phone calls, stolen minutes instead of hours. But desire doesn't stay hidden easily. One evening, while watering the plants in the yard, I caught Mark's eye across the fence. The way he smiled, slow and deliberate, made me feel like the world had narrowed to just the two of us. My husband was inside, watching television, yet I couldn't pull my gaze away. For a split second, I thought my husband might step outside and catch us locked in that look. The tension only grew. Each day felt like walking a tightrope, every word, every glance, every action carrying the risk of discovery. Yet, in some dangerous way, that risk only made the pull toward Mark stronger. We were no longer just neighbors sharing dinners and stolen moments. We had become something far more complicated, a secret that was becoming harder and harder to contain. And in the quiet hours of the night, lying beside my husband who slept soundly and unaware, I began to wonder not just how long we could keep this hidden, but whether part of me wanted it to be discovered. Because secrets, I was learning, have a way of demanding the light. The tension inside my home grew heavier with each passing week. My husband's eyes lingered too long, his questions cut a little deeper, and I could feel the sharp edge of suspicion forming between us. He started coming home earlier than usual, sometimes unannounced, moving through the house as if testing me, as if waiting to catch me in a lie I hadn't yet spoken aloud. One evening, I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner when he walked in, quietly watching me with a gaze that made my hands tremble. "You've been different lately," he said softly, not accusatory, but searching. I forced a smile and brushed it off, claiming stress or fatigue, yet I knew my eyes betrayed me. Because when I closed them, I didn't see him, I saw Mark. The way he leaned against his doorframe waiting for me. The way his hand rested on the small of my back, as though it belonged there. That night, lying beside my husband, I couldn't sleep. My body was in my marriage bed, but my heart was next door. The guilt pressed down on me, suffocating and still. When I heard the faint buzz of my phone with Mark's name lighting up the screen, I couldn't ignore it. "Can't stop thinking about you," his message read. My fingers hovered over the reply. Every part of me screaming to stop, but I typed back anyway. "Me neither." We became reckless. Quick visits under the pretense of borrowing sugar, a lingering touch exchanged at the mailbox, the stolen hours when my husband left for early meetings. The secrecy made it thrilling, but it also sharpened the danger. Every moment with Mark felt like fire warm, consuming, and impossible to step away from. Then came the night that shifted everything. My husband returned from a short trip and found me in the yard, hair still messy, a flush in my cheeks I couldn't hide. I'd just come from Mark's apartment, and though I tried to compose myself, there was a look in my husband's eyes that told me he saw more than I wanted him to. "Who are you with?" he asked, his voice low, almost careful. My heart stopped, but I forced a laugh, pretending I had been gardening. He didn't argue, didn't press further, but the silence that followed was worse than any accusation. He kissed my forehead before bed, lingering just a second too long, and I knew he was waiting for a slip, for proof. For the truth I couldn't admit. The next few days, Mark noticed the change in me. "He's starting to see it, isn't he?" he asked one evening as I sat on his couch, nervously twisting the hem of my dress. I nodded, unable to speak. Mark reached for my hand, squeezing it, promising that we would figure it out. But the promise only deepened the weight of what I had done. I started to live in fragments, half my life wrapped in lies and stolen glances, the other half trying to maintain the facade of a faithful wife. The two worlds were colliding, and I could feel the impact drawing closer. Every night I told myself I'd end it, that I'd walk away from Mark before the truth exploded and destroyed everything. But then I'd remember the way his eyes lit up when he saw me, how alive I felt in his presence, how much of myself I had found in his arms. And every time I chose him again, knowing the cost was coming, the question wasn't if the secret would be exposed. It was when the unraveling began on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when my husband appeared in the doorway holding my phone. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, his knuckles white against the screen. My stomach dropped before he even spoke. "Who's Mark?" His voice was calm, almost too calm, and that scared me more than if he had shouted. I froze, the knife trembling in my hand. There was no way to explain the thread of messages, the late-night calls, the pictures we had exchanged of dinners and walks that looked far too intimate to be innocent. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. He set the phone on the counter and looked at me with eyes I barely recognized. Hurt, confusion, betrayal all swirling into something heavy I couldn't bear. "All this time," he said quietly, "right next door." I wanted to deny it, to scramble for some excuse, but the truth hung in the air undeniable. My silence was its own confession. That night was a blur of questions I couldn't answer. He asked when it started, why it happened, whether I still loved him. I tried to explain the loneliness, the way I had been reaching for him for so long and found nothing but distance. But even as I spoke, I knew the words sounded hollow. Excuses never eased the sting of betrayal. For the next few days, the house was unbearable. We moved like strangers, avoiding each other, speaking only when necessary. The silence was suffocating. I found myself drifting toward Mark more, clinging to him as though he could steady the chaos I had unleashed. He held me, whispered that it would be okay, but I saw the flicker of worry in his eyes too. This wasn't just a secret anymore, it was a storm, and we were standing in the center of it. One evening, my husband came home early and caught sight of me slipping back from Mark's apartment. His expression was unreadable, but the way his jaw tightened told me everything. He didn't speak a word. He just walked past me into the house, leaving me outside in the gathering dark. That silence was worse than any fight. The confrontation finally came 2 nights later. He sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared countless dinners, birthdays, and quiet mornings. "I can't do this," he said. "I can't look at you and not see him. I don't know who you are anymore." Tears blurred my vision, but he didn't reach for me. For years, I had wanted him to see me, to want me, and now that he was finally looking, it was too late. I whispered apologies, begged for a chance to make it right, but he just shook his head. "You made your choice." After he left the room, I sat there alone, staring at the empty chairs, the half-eaten dinner growing cold. The house that once felt too quiet now felt unbearable. I walked next door, to Mark's place where the lights glowed warmly against the night. When he opened the door, I fell into his arms, sobbing. He held me, whispering that we'd figure it out together, but deep down I knew the truth. What we had wasn't built to last. It was built in shadows and secrecy, and now it had been dragged into the light. Yet even as guilt consumed me, I couldn't stay away from him. The damage was done, the pieces scattered, and I no longer knew which life was mine to claim. The weeks that followed blurred into one another. My husband moved into the guest room, and though we lived under the same roof, it felt like we were already divorced. He went through the motions, work, meals, the occasional phone call with friends, but with me, there was nothing left. No arguments, no accusations, just silence so heavy it pressed down on my chest whenever we crossed paths. Mark tried to be my escape from it all. He would text me to come over or slip notes into my mailbox when he knew I couldn't answer. His apartment became the only place I felt like I could breathe. We'd sit on his couch, close but quiet, as though both of us knew the weight of what we'd done but didn't dare speak it aloud. Sometimes he'd reach for my hand, and for a moment, I'd let myself believe that what we had could be real. But then I'd return home, back to the house full of memories and unspoken grief, and reality would crush me again. One evening, my husband finally broke the silence. He came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and leaned against the counter. His arms crossed. His voice was steady, but there was a finality in it I'd never heard before. "I've spoken to a lawyer," he said, my hands stilled over the cutting board. He didn't need to say anything more. The life we had built, the years we had shared, it was all unraveling faster than I could hold on. I told Mark about it that night. He listened, nodding slowly, but there was no relief in his face. If anything, he seemed troubled. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he asked, not just running from the wreckage. His words stung because they forced me to look at what I had been avoiding. Was I really choosing him, or was I just clinging to the one place that made me feel alive when everything else was crumbling? Days turned into weeks, and my husband moved out. The house felt emptier than ever, stripped of his presence, but still haunted by his absence. Friends started to ask questions. Some had seen me and Mark together, others had noticed my husband's sudden withdrawal. The whispers spread quickly, and soon I couldn't walk down the street without feeling the weight of my neighbors' stares. Mark tried to shield me from it. He'd invite me over, cook dinner, pour wine, and talk about everything, except the mess around us. He wanted us to feel normal, to believe that this could be the beginning of something instead of the end. But even in those moments, I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that the foundation of what we had was cracked. One night, as we sat on his balcony watching the stars, he finally said what had been simmering between us. "I care about you," he admitted, his hand warm over mine. "But sometimes I wonder if we'd even be here if things were different with your marriage." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that what we shared was real. And maybe it was, but deep down, I couldn't silence the nagging thought that he was right. Our connection had been born out of loneliness, out of need, out of the spaces where my marriage had failed. Could that really survive the light of day? The divorce papers came sooner than I expected. I signed them in a blur, my hands shaking. Tears staining the ink. It was over. Years of a life built together reduced to a handful of signatures. That night, I went to Mark, expecting comfort, expecting something to make the ache bearable. Instead, he held me quietly, his lips brushing my hair, and I realized he was grieving too not for my marriage, but for the fact that nothing between use would ever be simple again. The secret that had once felt thrilling was no longer a secret. It was my reality. And as I lay in Mark's arms that night, I wondered if the fire that had drawn us together could survive now that it was exposed. To the world, the weeks after the divorce felt like stepping into a world I didn't quite recognize. The house no longer felt like home, so I packed my things and moved into a smaller apartment across town. It was quieter, simpler, but the silence often pressed in too close, reminding me of everything I had lost. Mark helped me move, carrying boxes up the stairs, making jokes to lighten the mood, cooking dinner on the first night so I wouldn't sit on the floor eating takeout alone. At first, it felt like a fresh start. He'd show up with flowers or a bottle of wine or just a smile that reminded me why I had crossed the line in the first place. We'd laugh together in my kitchen, fall asleep on the couch watching old movies, and wake up tangled in sheets that smelled of coffee and something dangerously close to happiness. I wanted to believe we had finally found our place outside the shadows, but reality has a way of creeping in. People talk and soon the whispers grew louder. Friends I had known for years stopped calling. Invitations to dinners and gatherings disappeared. Even at work, I caught the way colleagues glanced at me when they thought I wasn't looking. I had been the woman who betrayed her marriage for the neighbor, and that reputation clung to me. No matter how much I tried to move forward, Mark pretended not to notice, but I could see the strain in him too. Some of his friends pulled away, and his family, who had always been polite to me at neighborhood events, looked at me differently. Now, it wasn't just us in our little bubble anymore. It was us against a world that seemed eager to judge. The cracks started small. He'd get quiet when I brought up my ex-husband, not out of jealousy, but out of exhaustion. He wanted me to leave the past in the past, but I couldn't not when so much of my life was still tangled in it. Some nights, I would lie awake beside him, wondering if I had made a mistake, if I had traded one kind of emptiness for another, yet there were moments that reminded me why I stayed. Like the time he surprised me with a weekend trip to the coast, where we walked along the beach with no one to judge us, no one to whisper. We laughed like we used to, shared stories late into the night, and for a while it felt easy again. Or the night he came home after a long day, wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "I don't care what anyone says, I choose you." Those moments carried me through the doubts, but the doubts never fully left. Sometimes when I looked at him, I wondered if he felt the same. If he, too, questioned whether we had been built on temptation and secrecy, and whether the fire that had burned so hot could survive in the light, one evening, months after I had moved into the new apartment, I ran into my ex-husband at the grocery store. He looked older, tired, but there was a calm in his eyes I hadn't seen before. We exchanged polite words, nothing more, but as I walked away, I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe. Or the sudden realization that no matter what, a part of me would always be tied to the life I had walked away from. When I told Mark about the encounter, he grew quiet. "Do you still love him?" he asked finally. The question caught me off guard, and I couldn't answer right away. Because love wasn't simple anymore. I didn't love my ex the way I used to, but I couldn't deny that what we had once shared mattered. Mark saw my hesitation, and though he didn't press, I knew the silence had said enough. Time passed and life settled into a rhythm. Some days were full of laughter, others full of questions. Mark and I built something together, fragile but real. It wasn't the wild secret it once was, nor is it the steady comfort I've once known in marriage. It was somewhere in between messy, complicated, but ours, and though the whispers never fully faded, though the doubts never fully disappeared, I learned to live with them. Because life isn't always about choosing the easy path. Sometimes it's about choosing the one that makes You feel alive, even if it leaves scars.